All right, and we are recording, so we are now live.
Okie dokie.
Okay, and hello and welcome to Torrent Book Club. I'm your host, Josh Saruman, as always, and Jan is saying Josh is late. He must be watching Batman. No, not true. I'm only a couple minutes late. Not enough time to watch Batman. But as you can see in the window next to me is Kellie Rice, aka Kili from Happy Hobbit, aka K.M. Rice, the author, aka somebody who has actually written a translation of Beowulf.
With a lot of help.
With a lot of help. And so this is our long delayed episode discussing J.R.R. Tolkien's Beowulf. Which I have, there it is. That thing. And I read it a while ago. I've been going through the notes and the commentaries in the book. And I think Kelly has been doing so as well. And
I have, with mixed results.
yeah. Like, a lot of the commentary I've been going through is just sort of like breaking down the translations of all the different words. Which is cool and all, but I'm like, I want more context in the history.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and the term in terms of defining what specific words mean, it's we do not have a complete lexicon, so that's actually impossible to do.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a matter of opinion.
Yeah, like that's the thing that I was noticing in the commentary is that a lot of it sort of sounded speculative.
Mm-hmm.
Like it was like this is our best guess.
Yeah.
But before we get too deep into it, just going to give everybody in the chat a quick reminder of what our book of the month is for, what is this, August? August, yes.
Yeah.
We just announced it last week. It is All Creatures Great and Small by James Herriot, which I actually just finished reading last night. And it's not the kind of book I would think I'd be into, but I got really, really into it. Like I couldn't put it down. So, and that was suggested to us by Light of the King, or no, sorry, by I Stole the One Ring. And I really like this book, and it got a very positive and enthusiastic response when I announced it last week. So I might be doing more user suggestions from here on out for books of the month. So that's the book of the month, and now we can talk about Beowulf. So I know Light of the King has been saying that she has all sorts of questions for us, so she can fire away whenever she wants, but in the meantime, I'll just get started on my own takeaways from this, and we can just sort of go from there. First of all, before this, I had never read Beowulf in any way whatsoever, and specifically because I knew that there was going to be, or that Tolkien had written a translation, and I thought, well, I'll just find that translation that Tolkien wrote, and it was nowhere to be found. And so I'm like, well, they got to put it out eventually, so I'll just wait. And so because of that, I had never read Beowulf. I did see the ridiculous Robert Zemeckis movie, and that was about my only exposure to Beowulf before this. And now that I've read this, I'm like, this is a really darn good story.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I also noticed is how many parallels there are between this and Thorin in The Hobbit.
Yes. Exactly.
Like, Thorin is pretty much Beowulf.
Exactly.
And, I mean, I'm guessing you probably saw that, like, right away, or when you were reading the books or seeing the movies, right?
To be honest, I wasn't watching it or reading it looking for parallels because, well, here's what's weird. I was introduced to Beowulf before Lord of the Rings.
Mm-hmm.
But once that thought kind of clicks, then it's like it can't be unseen.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah, exactly.
And so once I did notice that connection, I was like, and then that. Okay, I see what you were doing here. Like,
Yeah. Exactly. And it was like, it was kind of interesting, like, noticing that parallel while reading Beowulf. Like, now Thorin has, like, a totally different, like, I'm seeing Thorin from a totally different perspective now.
yeah.
Which is interesting because, like, I mean, what happens to Thorin is tragic.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens to Beowulf is also kind of tragic, but also at the same time, like, almost predestined.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that was sort of my takeaway from it. Like what happens with him was, like, sort of just bound to happen at some point.
Right.
Okay, so Light of the King is bringing up some of her questions. 3 topics: how it relates to Middle Earth, The Hobbit, some language questions, and then the countries/clans. Well, we're already talking about how it relates to Middle Earth and The Hobbit.
Yeah.
I don't know. Well, the language questions, that's an interesting one. And the countries and clans, I don't know all that much about it. Like that, like I was saying, that was the thing about the commentary that, or the notes in the commentaries that I felt was a little lacking, was that it didn't give a lot of historical context. It sort of just guessed a lot of the stuff. But,
I can tell you off the top of my head what I know of the history of the actual manuscript,
okay.
which is, I mean, you kind of have to have a brief lesson in English history just in case you're a little rusty on it. But, you know, England was inhabited by the native Britons.
Mm-hmm.
And after the Romans invaded around 400 AD, they started to withdraw because their empire was falling apart at the heart of their culture. And so they had to retreat back to Rome. So they were calling all of their legions out from the far-flung
Right.
corners of their empire, which included Britain. Britain was as far west as they ever went, as far as we know. And so they were pulled away. And in that vacuum, after they essentially did to the native Britons what you know, Caucasian settlers did to Native Americans. They shattered their culture. They tried to destroy their language, and they you know, if you were a peaceful type of person or your community was more peaceful, then they tried to incorporate you. If not, they built walls to keep you out. With varying degrees of success. That's what they did to the Picts in Scotland.
Mm-hmm. That's like Hadrian's Wall, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, Emperor Hadrian decided that was a good idea. Apparently it worked, I don't know. But
there isn't much left of it now, from what I understand, or I've seen some pictures of it. It's just like a couple rocks, I think.
yeah. Yeah. Well, it was like a couple thousand years ago.
Yeah.
And I'm sure people steal rock, you know, back in the day probably stole rocks from it for their own fences and stuff. I would.
Probably, yeah. All that rock just sitting there doing nothing.
So when the Romans were pulling out, the people of the north, there are several different tribes. 3 in particular, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Utes. And they were all up in the area of modern Denmark and Sweden and Finland. It's important to note that Vikings never existed. That's just kind of a modern term we slap onto a group of people who went a Viking. To Vik is a verb. A Vik is a village by the sea. So if you were going a Viking, you were going to go raid and pillage a village by the sea because you suck and you can't grow your own food or anything like that. You're just going to steal it from other people. So that's where the term comes from. Okay. But of course, there's never one group of people called Vikings. But we kind of collectively refer to the Northmen as Vikings. So when the Romans started pulling out, the Britons knew that the tribes of the north were going to invade. They'd been harassing them all along, and now was the time. So there was a king named Vortigern, who was an English king, or British king, and he invited 2 mercenaries from the north to come and defend him, because he thought, who better to defend my people from the men of the north than 2 men of the north? Their names were Hengist and Horsa. And we have a surviving document from them. What they did is they showed up, they looked around, they saw how fertile England was, and instead of defending the English, they wrote back home saying, the land is fertile and the men are weak. come as soon as you can.
Of course.
So they sent over a bunch of warriors who they said were like the leaders of their people, and they hosted a big party this one night. So Vortigern, the British leader, invited a lot of the local tribal leaders and just leaders of the local communities to come and sit down. And the idea was, we're all going to sit at a long table, we're all going to relinquish our weapons at the door, and we're going to have a peaceful dinner, and this is the start of a new era. So the British honestly believed that this is what was going on. They all relinquished their weapons, they all sat down, then at a given signal, all the Norsemen pulled out hidden swords, reached to the guy across from them, and killed him. So that night was known as the Betrayal of the Long Knives, or the Night of the Long Knives, which, if you know World War II history, then they adapted that name for the night that Hitler and his Nazis went and killed all the people in power who opposed him.
Right.
So then, from then, the Saxons were a flood that, couldn't be stopped. In the past, they had lingered on the coasts because they would be stopped if they tried to go further inland. But now they had all of England, and so that's why it's called England. The Angle tribe, they came and they named it Angleland, which became England. Mm-hmm. So that's the language we speak. We speak the language of our conquerors.
Mm-hmm. It's usually how it goes.
Yeah. And so the language that Beowulf is written in is Anglo-Saxon. For the two tribes were speaking this language, or we call it Old English. So it's alternatively Anglo-Saxon or Old English. The strange thing, I'd say, about the actual Beowulf manuscript is that it was recorded, like many ancient stories, a good deal after the events of the story took place. Mm-hmm. And it was written, it's a pagan story, but it's written with a Christian spin. And the only reason that we have the story is because because monks were the only people who were scribes at the time, so they were the only people recording stuff. Mm-hmm. The monk who wrote it down hid it in a book with a bunch of religious tales. I think they might have been tales of saint lives. He wrote it down in the back, so that if someone were to come through the monastery and fan through the book to make sure there's nothing, that's just a fun read. It had to all be either spiritual in nature or for teaching reasons and such. So because that monk did that, we have the manuscript. The manuscript.
Interesting. And
so the people,
and that was actually one thing
wrote
that
it down.
Yeah. No,
I'm sorry?
I was just gonna say, it was like that sort of gives some clarity, because like while I was reading it, I was like kind of surprised by how much Christian mythology was in it, or how much Christian references were in it.
Yeah.
I was like, this doesn't feel like this is the kind of culture that would embrace Christianity like that, but maybe I just don't know my history well enough.
Well, that's a big debate, actually. Mm-hmm. And so the scribe who actually wrote down the poem, which we know he must have heard orally, that's how stories were passed on.
Right.
It stuck with him so much that he chose to write it down, and he memorized it and wrote it down. He's writing down a story of his conquerors. That you guys have all read it now, so it takes place not in England. It takes place up in the north, in Scandinavia. So.
Oh, Light of the King is saying that she's actually seen the Noel Codex of Beowulf at the British Museum.
Oh, that's awesome. That's really cool.
Yeah.
So there was a debate for a long time, and it's pretty much been settled. It's pretty easy to tell, as even reading it for the first time, Josh, as you pointed out, the Christian elements really feel just stuck in there.
Yeah.
And so scholars generally agree that that's what happened. That at some point someone took the pagan poem and tried to Christianize it, with obviously somewhat failed results, because the values of Beowulf don't exactly align with the values of a more humble servant of God.
Not so much. Like I thought it was interesting, like how it seemed to like create like this whole idea that Grendel is actually descended from Cain, and that the monsters are all descended from Cain in that way. And I'm like, okay, that's an interesting thought. I don't really think that it jibes biblically, but still.
And so then the question is, why?
Yeah.
Was it the one guy who wrote it down? Was he every once in a while being like, this is such a great, like, superhero story? What if my boss sees this? And God is great.
Yeah.
So anyway, then there's blood and death, and you know, God passed some judgment. And, you know, that's one theory. But that's like something we're never going to know.
The 10th century equivalent of, like, hiding your browser history.
Exactly. And I do think that's why he was so enamored with this poem and wanted to write it down for other generations, because it is, like, to this day, so exciting.
It is. Like, that was the thing that shocked me the most about it, was, like, I was riveted by this thing. Like, I didn't think that I would be. But it was an absolute page-turner. And I don't know if that's just the quality of the story or the quality of Tolkien's translation of it or a combination of both, but, like, I was totally into it.
Yeah. So I first got exposed to it when I was in junior high. Before we get into that, Light of the King did ask a question a little while ago. Yeah.
She did. I just wanted... I was fascinated by the history you were going through, so I'm like, okay, let's wait until that's done. Okay, so her first question is regarding Middle-earth. How do you see the connections with Ring Danes, Giver of Rings, Barrow Wights, and the word Orseus related to the Hellions / undead? I don't even know what any of that means. Or I don't like. I mean, we talked a little bit about how it relates to Middle-earth.
Yeah. I mean, that's story-wise. Linguistically, though, there's a ton of connections. As I'm sure a lot of you know, this language, the Beowulf was written in, is the language Tolkien assigned to the Rohirrim, to the people of Rohan. They're speaking Old English. So when you hear Miranda Otto sing that funeral song that she's singing in Old English, there's a lot of linguistic links. For example, Meduseld, the name of Theoden's hall, is also the name of Hrothgar's hall. And so Tolkien was trying to draw some obvious parallels, and there's parallels to be drawn not only between Beowulf and Thorin, but Beowulf and Theoden.
Okay.
Even just
Light of the King is saying she can give us some page numbers to help specify what she's talking about. If you could, that would be great. So.
Yeah, even just the name Middle Earth, that comes from Anglo-Saxon, Midgardjerda, because in the Anglo-Saxon belief there was sort of like a spiritual realm above, and sort of a like an ancient realm below. It wasn't a hell, but an ancient, kind of like the Celtic belief of where the fair folk live, where the trickery comes from, and then we exist in the middle.
Right.
We exist in a liminal state between, and so we exist in the Middle Earth.
Right.
So that's where Tolkien set his, he specified that that's where his story's taking place.
Yeah. So Temple brings up Midgard. It's like that's kind of the same thing, isn't it? Or
that it's the same word.
It's the same word. Yeah.
That's actually a I mean, G. This is part of what bothered me with this translation. He doesn't mark G and G with a dot over it are two different letters.
Okay.
And Christopher hasn't, or whoever set up the typing of this, hasn't differentiated between the two, which is a big problem when you're going through this and trying to go, okay, so what word is that? So it's kind of crippling to be someone who knows the language a little bit and then not be able to, it just adds that extra leg of.
That would be a little frustrating, yeah.
Yeah, and so G with a dot over it is actually more of a Y. So that's why Middle Earth is Midgard.
Okay.
So Midgard, someone saw that and just assumed it was a G, and pronounced it that way.
Okay. So Light of the King is saying the Hellions are related to the orcs from the word Orcus or Orcaeus.
Okay.
I don't know. Do you know anything about that? I don't.
I only know a little bit about it because I was having a conversation on one of the message boards about it, because I found it amusing that the word orc, just plain orc, in Old English means cup.
Oh, okay.
So it's like they're being attacked by a bunch of cups.
Okay.
But someone pointed out, yeah, that it's part of a root word to it started off as water demons,
Okay.
and from what I recall, it was yeah, an ancient term for demons of that ilk.
Okay. So,
Oh,
Light of the King just gave us a couple pages to look at, and you've got the actual print version. I've got a Kindle version, so
oh,
all of
okay.
my pages are not going to match up with that. But for
Yeah.
you, it's page 16, 23, and 70. Uh, and she's saying or chaos is on page 163. So I can try to flip through this, but yeah.
Oh, you the ring date. Okay, so the Tolkien's inspiration for the rings came from two places. One of them is here. They
Mm-hmm.
call them the Ring Danes because the king was a ring giver. He was known as a ring giver.
Uh-huh.
They were a culture where fealty, loyalty, and bonds of kinship and friendship were reinforced by giving of gifts. So they were
Right.
called a gift-giving culture. When they're talking about rings and the king giving rings to his retainers, he's not specifically talking about little gold rings that go on your finger. If you think about it in terms of value and worth, if you're living in that era, a little trinket that you could put on your finger might be portable, but how much, is that metal actually worth?
Mm-hmm.
The rings that they would actually be trading in would be more bracelets and bands that go around your arm. And
Oh,
so,
okay.
yeah, and so all of the kings, the great kings, were great ring givers because they would healthily reward their knights, their warriors for their service by saying, "This is how much I value you. Take this." Instead of the king, more like modern times, or like Smaug or the worm in Beowulf,
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to take all my gold, I'm going to sit on it, and I'm not going to share it with anyone.
Yeah.
Uh, so that the kings were very generous in that sense because it was a symbiotic relationship and they knew that they needed the men. The other source were a lot of medieval texts, and one is Yvain, the Knight of the Lion. He has a ring that can turn him invisible.
Okay.
And so there's a lot of medieval texts with magic rings. And that one stood out to me because that did something that was the same as, the One Ring,
Yeah.
when I read it back in college. But there, as far as I know, there was never a specific ring that could control the thoughts or the minds of people. I think that was all Tolkien, just taking these ideas and taking it one step further.
Okay. Interesting. And yeah, that's like, and it seems like a logical progression too. Like
Yeah.
just having a ring that just takes complete control of you, especially when they're given such metaphorical power
Yeah.
with the gift giving, because because the gift giving, like, it really does sort of like give a very strong symbolic power to the ring. So I sort of feel like
Right.
what Tolkien was doing was giving actual power to the ring, which
Right, that's
which
true.
makes a lot of sense to me. Now everybody in the chat is talking about evil cups because of orc.
That'd be a hilarious fan film, a literal translation.
Yeah, right.
Look out, guys! It's a bunch of cups.
Now,
We were just
now
the
I want to
Hobbit
see
was just
that.
on the Hobbit was just on the Spanish channel, and they interpreted Bilbo as Bebo,
Really?
and instead of Baggins, it was bolsas because literally that's bags
Oh
in
wow,
Spanish. So
Oh
it was
my
Bebo
God.
bolsas.
that's such a goofy name. That's like right up there with Bingo Baggins.
I know. They were just lucky that it was still alliterative.
Yeah, right. So, so what are some of the other?
I know. Sorry, guys, I can't see the chat.
No, that's okay. I'm sort of going. I'm going through it right now. Everybody's talking about evil cups, so that's about all we got going on right now. I'm gonna scroll back up to some of what Lady the King was saying. Looks like so there was page 16, 23, and 70. And then she
So
mentioned.
16, I saw the reference to the Ring Danes, if that's what she was.
Yeah, I'm not sure what's on 23 and 70.
Let's see.
Oh, wait, we got another question from Lady the King. Question 2. Kelly, when you were translating back in college, what are your thoughts on the words vouchsafed, weird, and kenning? I know you said words are nebulous, but please finish. Oh, but please finish your Middle Earth connections before you go on to the next questions.
Weird. Weird is a very powerful word in this language. Weird means fate.
Oh, okay.
And it has survived as weird, and sometimes our fates are weird. I find the transition of the word from its actual, meaning in history to what part of it survives fascinating. So yeah, weird is a word that we still have as weird, but it means fate, and it meant that was a very powerful presence, I think, in their culture. They were big believers in fate, and that to speak the word, even oral cultures had this, I won't say superstition, because I think there's a lot of truth to it. They understood the power of words, especially spoken words. So if you were to say a thing, that was in a sense to create it into being. So if someone looks at you and says, I'm cursing you, and puts some curse on you or your household, whether you believed that person was magical or whatever, the fact that they threw that negative energy behind their words at you, they believed could have, an impact. And if you think of it scientifically, I've had it explained that, you're having the thought, you're moving the vocal cords, you're shattering the air to make these vibrations. They're hitting the other person's ear. They're being shaken around and being reinterpreted as something of significance. So in that sense, words are changing the environment around us.
Yeah.
In a microscopic way.
Yeah. Like, not in like any like major way, but yeah. Well, I the power of words has always been like a very strong theme throughout anything. Like most well, I mean, just the concept of like magic words and spells and stuff like that, and all sorts of fantasy. And one of the series that I read a lot of is the Dresden Files, and one of the things they talk about is over and over again is never speak your full name to a magic user, because they will then know your true name, and when they mean your true name, what they mean not only is your full name, but also how you pronounce it, the inflection you use in it, and that gives them all the power over you.
Oh yeah, and that's a very ancient and medieval concept that you will, if you do get interested in medieval literature, you'll encounter it again and again. A lot of the Arthurian legends, someone will come into the court and they'll be like, "Don't let them speak yet." If you make a pledge, if you say, "I vow," because in a lot of the Welsh and English tales, it's someone shows up and then a knight makes a promise. "I will come a year and a day." That was their little thing. It was always a year and a day. "I will return to you a year and a day from right now." And if you spoke that, you better do it, because that, this was, well, nowadays we're like, oh, you have to have a lawyer and you have to sign stuff and everything.
Yeah.
But for them, the official agreement was just to say it. I think I've gone off of what
That's okay.
what she was asking, the word weird, and I can't remember what was the other word. It was
let me go back. Let's see, vouchsafed and kenning.
kennings are I'm sure I know Light of the King, you were reading the notes, so I'm sure you know what kennings are. I love kennings. Kennings are taking usually two words. I don't think they really always have to be alliterative. I think that's just the translator's choice. Two words, it's basically a metaphor. A two-word metaphor that makes you just see the world in a different way. Sometimes it's more than two words. Like off the top of my head, Beowulf's ship in the actual script is foamy-necked floater, which to me, I know exactly. I see the prow of the ship with sea foam around it as it's floating along. And to me, that it so succinctly creates such a vivid image that it immerses me.
Yeah.
And I like the brevity. And so I kind of was surprised when I was reading the notes and having Christopher Tolkien taking a very literal approach, deconstructing one of my favorite phrases, whale road, saying, no one's going to understand this. Everyone's going to think it's a whale walking on pavement and all this stuff. And it's like, not if you have any imagination.
Yeah.
Any imagination, you immediately think that's where the whale swims. It's
Yeah.
a current, you know, it's so, I was actually really, surprised by some of his choices and the stuff he chose to nitpick.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, well, I mean, Whale Road, yeah, definitely I didn't think anything weird about that one.
Yeah.
But I don't know, maybe it's because coming from a scholarly background, some people just take things very literally and don't really, or very concrete sequentially.
I think that's exactly it. I think that for good or ill, I have no idea what Christopher. I'm sorry, I'm not very familiar with Christopher Tolkien or his works. I don't know if he's an imaginative author. I don't know if he's written his own stories or if he's just tried his best to adapt all his father's stuff. But my impression was this is someone who has very little ability to think outside of the actual words in front of him. Mm-hmm. Whereas when I was reading it and translating it, it was for a completely different motivation and reason. It was because I liked the way the kennings and the point of view of the poem, like when they first walk into Meduseld or Heorot. I'm sorry, I misspoke earlier. Meduseld is Beowulf's hall. At the end, Heorot is Hrothgar's hall.
Right.
So when they first walk into Heorot, everything's new, and they look at the benches that had not been touched by the flames of war. Just that sentence alone tells you the point of view, like, we know how transitory life is, how temporary everything in life is, and that one day some jerks from across the water are going to come and burn this all down, probably. Mm-hmm. So I found that that's what I loved about actually touching and experiencing the language of this poem. And I felt that Tolkien's translation really, really sanitized it and took away what I found appealing, which is why I was glad there was the foreword explaining that his father really struggled with trying to find the balance between the poetic and the creative, and how do I write it so that a guy, you know, because in Tolkien's era, the poem was not nearly as well respected as it is today. Mm-hmm. So he wanted to, you know, to kind of I won't say dumb it down, but he wanted it to be
accessible.
Yes, exactly, accessible to some guy off the street, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And since I am kind of the guy off the street who's never read it before, it was totally accessible for me. Like, I got into it. I mean, there were probably some elements to it that went over my head, but that didn't diminish my enjoyment of the story at all.
Yeah.
Like, what was I gonna say?
There's several weird parts where it will delve into, like, the history of so-and-so, but this is actually a myth, and I'm going to fill you in on all this. And then we'll go back to the present action.
That was the thing that I was curious about, because there are, like, these extraordinarily long tangents in it, where he'll, like, talk about the history of somebody who is kind of just very, very minorly involved, or like during the celebration after killing Grendel, like, they go into this huge history of something that just feels almost completely unrelated. And as I'm reading it, I'm like thinking, okay, is this foreshadowing? Is this going to relate to something that happens later on in Beowulf's life? And I did sort of feel like some of them, like, were sort of drawing, like, these parallels with what ultimately happens with Beowulf, and so it did sort of feel almost like foreshadowing, but that was sort of my impression of it. I just felt like there was so much of it that I was,
and I think that sometimes that's the nature of oral storytelling, like like maybe the guy who traveling and saying this story most often would get to a cultural reference like Hegel. And then everyone goes, oh, I love that one, and the crowd reacts, and then he goes, yeah, so okay, you guys, okay, so I'm going to talk about this for 5 minutes. Like, remember, everyone remembers this story, right? Where blah, 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 blah happens? Yeah, that's the one. Okay, anyway, back to Beowulf, you know? It could be that happened often enough that it became part of the poem, or it could be that the scribe who wrote it down, it triggered his thought, and he's like, people need to remember this as well, you know? So I'm going to put that in here.
That could be.
As an aside, sort of. It's interesting.
Yeah. What what I found interesting also is just sort of like the progression of the three challenges that Beowulf faces. I guess you could call them that, with Grendel's mother, and the dragon.
Yeah.
And how like each one is progressively more difficult, and the third one finally does him in. Spoiler alert. I don't know. Has the statute of limitations on spoilers been lifted on Beowulf at this point?
I mean, it's been around for about 3,000 years, so...
I would hope so.
Maybe it's only been 2,000. Maybe it's only been 1,000. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't do math.
It, like, watching this progression, and like I did sort of feel like I sensed a little bit of a foreshadowing in all of these big tangents. So like I sort of saw what was going to be happening.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it was interesting watching Beowulf as a character sort of progress, because there was a point, I think it was after he defeats Grendel's mother, that I think it was Hrothgar like takes him aside and tells him, you basically says, enjoy your victory now because it won't last.
Yeah.
And then we flash forward like what, about 10 years, 10, 20 years, something like that.
Yeah.
And he's a king, but there's the dragon that's been systematically stealing the wealth from everybody around him and hoarding it for itself. And this is like his ultimate challenge. But like with Hrothgar's warning, I sort of felt like this is the end game for him. This is what's going to do him in.
Yeah.
But I thought it was like a very interesting bit of wisdom on Hrothgar's part, that he basically said, enjoy your victory now, go back, build a kingdom, raise a family, enjoy life as much as you can, because one day it will all end.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that would, and I loved like that bit of foreshadowing as well.
And it sort of marks, like what you just said, sort of summarizes the tone of the poem in general.
Yeah.
Which is, there's a dark pall over it, because really it's a dirge.
Yeah.
Really it's a, it could be where some of Tolkien's fascination with the idea of the last of a people comes from. He dwells a lot on the elves, and the elves being the last, and the beauty and the sadness that comes in that. And for Beowulf, it is the ending of his tribe. So when Beowulf leaves, he chooses Vigaloth as his proxy or his next in line.
Successor, yeah.
Yeah, but really it's he knows that this is the end.
Yeah.
He gives that speech, kind of like how Thorin has a chance to give a speech, and he asks for the big tower to be built by the sea so that people will remember him and remember that his people had been there before.
Yeah. And that was really cool. And let's see, Light of the King brought up another one. Let me go back up here. My only other connection to Middle-earth that I wanted to mention was the corn shield that was noted from King Shiev. I can't pronounce these names. Oh god, this stupid chat. Pardon me. Chat fail. Okay. That was mentioned in The Lost Road from Letters. Okay, so...
Sorry, Feely just took my camera to edit our new episode.
Oh, okay.
If you saw Scary Arm.
Ah! No!
Hi!
Hi! Cameo by Feely. So... yeah, I'm not really sure what she's talking about here.
There's a whole section, especially in the beginning of the notes, talking about this legend about a child being brought in a boat full of corn.
Okay.
At this point in time, which again I find strange that Christopher Tolkien didn't know. See, I think Christopher was writing this for other scholars. I don't think he ever had in mind, which is silly because he knows the appeal that a Tolkien work has. I don't think he ever really geared this towards the common person, like someone in the book club who would pick this up and go, oh, I love Tolkien's work. I have no context for this. Someone more intuitive could have put in passages. For example, corn was not actually corn, it was wheat.
Oh.
Corn was the word until the domestication of wheat, or rather the discovery of wheat in the New World, many years after this was written. They took the name for wheat because it had the same kernel-like structure and just applied it to corn because that must just be big wheat. So when they talk about corn, what they're actually talking about is grain.
Okay.
So that would be obviously a life force and a sustaining symbol for them. I don't remember that story from my. Granted, I was studying Old English in 2005, but I do not remember that story, and I didn't remember encountering it in any translation. So I found those notes probably just as fascinating as you did, Light of the King. No, it was an interesting myth, and one of the things, if you pursue Old English, one of the things you'll discover is that most of the surviving manuscripts that we have are religious in nature.
Yeah.
Again, because the scribes who are writing them down are the monks. And so, like, a lot of my translations that, I started off with before I got to the big Beowulf, Keen Wolf and Keen Herd. I don't think that one's religious. That might be one of the few. But a lot of them are sermons that are left. A lot of them are like saints' tales, because in early Christianity, there's this really strange thing, at least in this corner of Europe, going on with the saints. And people would go to monasteries. Monasteries and nunneries were very popular places because it was just a better way of life. And, completely separate, for good or ill, from the religious draw. So it would attract people who would try to out-martyr each other. So,
yeah, it's kind of a thing.
So they were doing weird things like, like I'm sure everyone's heard of like the self-flogging. And then they would do stuff like they would find some rock in the middle of nowhere, climb up it, and then try to live there off of nothing for as long as they can, just to, become a saint. So there are a lot of those strange stories have been written down. Like, here's one, A Vision of Hell.
Okay.
About St. Paul.
Okay.
My translation is, as St. Paul was looking into the northern part of this middle earth, where all water departs down, and he there saw over that water a certain old stone. And there was grown upon the stone very much a frosted grove of wood, frosty trees. Sounds like a dessert. The darkness grew, the mists. It's like saints' visions and interesting things like that. Some of these stories are ones that, like, about kings from the Bible or things where they aren't actually in the Bible. Maybe they were kicking around as stories that were omitted, like, apocrypha, like stories that were omitted from the Bible, or that were maybe folk stories sprung up around the, like, here's another one from Solomon and Saturn.
Okay. Wait, we got another question from Light of the King. Question number 3. How similar do you find Old English to Middle English, and do you see similarities to Latin, Gaelic, and Welsh? You would probably know this better than me.
I can't speak for the Welsh. I don't really know any Welsh. I only know a teeny bit of Gaelic. They are unrelated. Welsh and Gaelic are the surviving descendants of the language of the ancient Britons. So remember, I was giving that brief history lesson. The Aboriginal people of Britain were speaking the Celtic languages because they were a Celtic people. Then the Romans came and brought with them their language. So then that's where Latin started to get infused. But ultimately, it was the English, the Anglo-Saxon language that dominated. So what happened was in 1066, we were invaded, well, not we, England was invaded again by the Normans, which weren't a bunch of guys named Norman, as fun as that is to imagine. Norman Osborn attacks.
I'm thinking of a totally different Norman. It's this character that they have on Riff Tracks, Norman Krasner, who is a guy who just like all the worst things in the world happen to him all at once.
That would be pretty cool then if he got revenge.
I know, right?
But so Norman means Northman, so men from the north, which was at that time it was part of France. So a bunch of French came, and at that point Latin spawned 5 different surviving languages that we call the Romance languages, which are Italian, French, Romanian, Spanish, and Portuguese. So at the time of 1066, these languages were already starting to develop. So the French came in and invaded, and that's why around 40% of our language that we speak today is French or Latin. And once you start noticing it, you'll see it all the time, like garage, for garage. A lot of what I think was really strange that happened is our words for food were hijacked and became the French words. So back in the day, if you were going to eat a hamburger, you'd say, I'm eating cow. I'm eating pig. I'm eating, but then the French came in for some reason. We decided, I'm eating pork, I'm eating hamburger. Yeah. So it's interesting to see where the words stuck and where they didn't stick. So Middle English is actually much more heavily influenced by Latin and the Romance languages than Old English. And it doesn't really, you can read Middle English, and if you're reading it out loud, if you're hearing it, you can identify what's going on. With Old English, you can't. Like, I could read a little bit of Old English, and you guys could hear.
Yeah.
I probably don't have the best pronunciation because it's been forever.
That's okay.
Like, here's one of my favorite things I translated. It's a poem called The Wanderer. Oh my gosh. I'll just read a little, just so you can hear how different it is. Oft himem haga ara jebedreth, metudes miltese, theothe he moltsherig, jeond lagulada, longa shelda, heran mid hondum, hrimshelda se, wadan wer klastas, wird bit full ared, Swaquith Earthstopper. Okay, wait, I have to stop at Earthstopper because
that's way better than I would have done with it.
Earthstopper, that's Earth Stomper, which is Strider.
Ah, okay.
So an Earth Stomper is someone who's wandering the earth. So that's why this poem is called The Wanderer. It's about someone who's treading the earth. And so that Tolkien read every Old English scrap that he could get his hands on, not just Beowulf, and you see a lot of those influences in his final works.
But I also heard another word in there that sounded almost like Legolas.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So you could hear from that, like, the pattern is you could recognize as English or German sounding, but the words themselves you can't point out. Whereas Middle English, which is like the language of the Wife of Bath's tale and those stories, you can actually hear, Juan in April, when in April, you can actually pick up on it and understand where it came from. And that's like the biggest thing that I've faced is, well, not faced, it's that I just kind of find humorous is when people are like, oh, what have you studied? What languages? And then I say, oh, I studied Old English, which is really difficult. And then they go, I love Shakespeare. And I'm like, cool, what does that have to do with anything? Like, you studied Old English and Shakespeare? Like,
yeah, that's not the same at all.
It's a different language. And what's fascinating is to see what words of Old English have survived. It's often the common verbs, and I think Light of the King, I think we already kind of had a little chat about this, but what I think is cool is the words that we use often in everyday speech stayed the same. For example, run. That's an Old English word. The original conjugation would be I rin, I ran, I run. A good way to remember that is other words that still exist in those forms. I sing, I sang, I sung.
Okay.
I dream, I dram. We don't have dram anymore. So there's a bunch of words that follow that pattern, and when you can pick out that pattern, then you know it's a word that's been in our language for thousands of years.
Yeah.
So that part's really interesting. And also, the words, like I was talking about, weird, the words that survive, but have a different significance to them. I just found a note right here. I know I've said this before on shows. Frode means like mature. It means to ponder, to think. So Frodo is a mature one who thinks on things. Dream used to mean glad. So literally the word for harp was like the glad wood or the happy wood. Like it would make you it would make you
happy.
Here I have it here. Gleovudu or Gleovudu. That's the word for harp, which is the joy wood or the dream. Or so that word survives in dream. Dream. So so it's like the dream wood or the joy wood, which I'm like so they would walk around and be like, "Hey, you gonna bring your joy wood?" "Yeah, I am." Like,
well, I mean, when you say it like that way, it has a totally different meaning.
It does. But it's like...
So the chat kind of exploded with your reading of Old English. Everybody loved it.
Oh, really?
And a couple people, Ava and Light of the King, were talking about how it sounds a lot like Elvish, which is true. Like I noticed that right away. It sounds like Elvish, but I think it was in the Silmarillion. I could be misremembering this. There's actually like a bit of a breakdown of Elvish. Or like the pronunciation of it and various meanings of the words. And I remember reading through that, and at the time in college, I was taking some sort of language course, and we talked a little bit about Old English, and I started seeing like parallels between the two of them like almost right away. And I think it was just because I happened to be studying both kind of at the same time.
Yeah.
Like very briefly, like I can't remember much of any of what I learned, but
well, what's interesting is, I mean, that was really my motivation for studying Old English. I remember at the time I had a choice. I could take an Arthurian mythology class and a class in Old English, and I wanted to take both so bad, but I couldn't. So I chose Old English because of my love of Tolkien. It, like, I just, seen the movies and read the books a few years prior to this. And I thought, I always had this, like, secret scheme because I was in this program called the Humanities Honors Program where we covered basically all of human history and as many works and philosophers and science and stuff as we could. It was for, like, students who had a certain GPA in high school and blah, blah, blah. So I loved that class, and I felt like by exposing myself to the classics and be, familiarizing myself with them as much as possible, I was getting the same education as my favorite writers had, because that used to be an education, which was Latin and Greek and learning all the classics. Right. So I thought, they're some of the best storytellers, so maybe I could learn or pick up whatever it is they picked up, and be a good storyteller. So then from that, I found Tolkien, and then found out that Tolkien, also studied Old English. And plus, I was just, my exposure to it and knowing that it was the language of Beowulf, which I'd loved since junior high, I wanted to pursue it. And that was the really fun part to me, would be to go through the poem, find the words that everyone just throws their hands up and goes, no clue what this means. No clue what this is in reference to. And to see that those are all the words that Tolkien went, cool. And he wrote down, and he assigned his own meaning and put them in his books, like Elendil. Elendil is a word. It's a reference at some point, I think towards the middle or the end of the poem, where everyone, when we're doing our translations, we go home and we translate so many lines. And then we go to class, and then we go around and we read, this is what I got, this is what I got, this is what I got. And, the teacher knows this stuff, the professor, she knew this stuff so well that if, you got something wrong, she'd be like, actually, that's this, because of that, let me explain it to you, or whatever. But then we get to these words that no one knows, and she's just like, and then Erendil. Anyway, keep going, and blah, blah, blah. And then, so, what I think is different from Christopher is that the Professor Tolkien was obviously looking at this, looking for the holes. Like, he wanted to know it all, but where he found the holes, his imagination was sparked and his creativity was fed, and he got excited by it. Whereas I think that his son, a little bit, at least in this translation, was kind of like, no, take it literally. You know, it has to be these words.
Well, I don't want to disparage Christopher Tolkien in any way, because I mean his contribution to the furthering of his father's work is very, very impressive.
Yeah,
and very important.
We wouldn't have this stuff if not for him.
Yeah, like we wouldn't have the Silmarillion, we wouldn't have the history of Middle Earth, we wouldn't have the Lost Tales, we wouldn't have Beowulf, we wouldn't have Fall of Arthur or anything like that. Like we'd have The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, and that'd be it.
Exactly.
What I will say, like, is that he does seem to sort of lack the same sort of creative flair that his father had.
And he, you know, and I get that too, but I feel like also he's a different person, and and so it's just kind of fascinating to see the two completely different approaches to the same text, you know.
Well, yeah, and I mean, and I also think that also might be like he's probably a little bit intimidated by what his father did, because I mean, like what you're describing of what Tolkien was doing of taking these words that everybody just sort of ignores or passes over and like trying to ascribe a true meaning to it, like that is a very intimidating thing to do.
Yeah.
And it's not something anybody off the street can do, or we'd all do it.
Yeah. Definitely.
So I do sort of wonder if there's like a level of intimidation that comes from that.
Well, and especially too knowing how many people, if you're not a scholar who's spent years and years in this field, which I am in no way at that level, I think that it would be intimidating to be writing for a community that you know is going to nitpick every word you say.
Right.
Everything that you write about it, and like I said, this book definitely seems much more geared towards the scholars, but at the same time, like I don't know enough about Christopher to know. Maybe he has spent decades studying this language.
It could be, and I mean, like he definitely spent a lot of time working on compiling this translation.
Yeah.
And I mean, you can tell Tolkien himself agonized over it as well, with all these different manuscripts.
Yeah.
And Temple brings up an interesting point, or maybe he's so trying to preserve what his father did that he's afraid to use too much conjecture in case people take that as his father's view rather than his own.
True.
Yeah.
That could very well be.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Temple. So, Light of the King brought up another question about I am confused. Dang it, stupid chat. And now it's frozen.
Oh no.
No, it'll be fine. Okay, here we go. I am confused about the countries: the Geats, the Skildings, the Jutes, the Finns, the Franks, the Speardanes. Some were some clans in some countries, or what?
They were nations. They were different nations. Not in our modern sense of a nation, but in like, you're right to bring up clan, because I think that that's more, you know, brings to mind the picture of how they were actually structured.
Yeah. And I sort of took it as the idea of clan and country were sort of interchangeable terms. Like especially on a scale in that type of culture back then. Like, I mean that's how things were. I mean even in our own history in America before we signed the Constitution, before we ratified the Constitution, all the different states. All the different colonies that became states considered themselves their own separate and independent nations.
Yeah.
And so like you sort of have that evolution.
Sorry, I'm just looking through my notes to see if I have a single map that shows.
Oh, okay.
Where these people are. For some reason, I believe the Danes were on the more left-hand side. I don't know what that means. Maybe there's a reference in the poem that says he headed west to head home, but
there might be. I don't know. I sort of I sort of
I have
assumed he
the
was
history.
he came from the West, but I don't know.
Okay, I have the history of the Swedish wars in Beowulf.
Okay, that's something.
I'm not gonna really be able to interpret much of this for you. The Swedes attacked the gates, then returned home. Heithkin, the king of the gates, and Hygelac, his brother, attacked the Swedes in revenge and took Ongtheow's queen as prisoner. Ongtheow appeared, killed, I want to say Hyacinth, Heithkun, and rescued his queen. The gates fled into the woods, and Ongtheow threatened them with death by swords and gallows through the night. So I don't know if that means he stood on the edge of the forest and just screamed, "I'm going to chop off your heads," or what. Hygelac appeared with his division and attacked the Swedes at dawn. Ongtheow was killed by two guys named Eofor and Wulf. Eofor, as a reward, married the daughter of Hygelac, who is known as the King of the Gate, and is now known as the King of the Gates. Othir ruled the Swedes. Hygelac died in his Frankish expedition, and Herdred ruled the gates. When Othir died, Onela seized the Swedish throne. His nephews Eanmund and Edgilis fled the gates. The Gateland was attacked again by a half-Swede. Okay, so this does actually give you some context.
Yeah. Now, did you say Eamund is in what is it? Eomer, son of Eamund?
Yeah, and Eomer is in the text. I don't know if you guys saw that. Eomer's
actually, Light of the King brought that up.
So then Herdred, they were all killed, basically. Then Beowulf became the King of the Gates. Eadgils later killed Onela with Gatish help and became the King of the Swedes. So the Swedes are the Skildings.
Okay.
So I suppose the significance of that is that these people, as evidenced by the tone of the poem saying, the benches were beautiful before someone came along and killed them, burned them up, it was that they were constantly under threat from the power struggles going on. I haven't seen Game of Thrones, but it sounds like Game of Thrones.
Well, you mentioned, I didn't want to bring it up then, but you mentioned before the Night of the Long Swords. Mm-hmm. That it almost sounds like that inspired the Red Wedding in Game of Thrones, because the situation was very much the same.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm. And I don't want to go too much into it because I don't want to spoil Game of Thrones for you. Although I think at this point, the Red Wedding has probably been spoiled for you.
It's been pretty spoiled. I mean, just being around so many people who love that show, it's just unfortunately even when I'm not going to remember that, I do.
Yeah.
So what this outlines, though, is that the Swedes, the Skilds, were the enemies of the Gates. So why this was probably also such a powerful story at the time, their enemy was coming over to help them. So you know, a man from the tribe who they just recently had bloodshed and queen stolen and all that stuff. So that would justify some of the asides going, because I remember there was an aside about Onela and the queen who was stolen, and so that was probably setting the context of where this story is taking place in terms of the political struggles.
Okay.
Which I think is an interesting layer. I don't know, I've never watched any of the movie adaptations because I know I'll go into a rage, but
have any of them
dealt with the politic part?
Not that I've seen. I mean, okay, the only movie adaptation that I've watched was the animated one that Robert Zemeckis did. Which was, even having not read the poem at that time, I was like, I don't think any of this happened in the poem.
Probably not.
Because I'm watching it, and I'm like, this feels too Hollywood to have been written by these people way back when. Because basically in the Zemeckis movie, all three of the enemies that Beowulf has to face are interrelated to each other, and here's how.
Yeah.
Beowulf wounds and kills Grendel, and Grendel's mother, who is played by Angelina Jolie,
of course,
because I think the description in the poem is something like hairy she-wolf or something like that, or like it was like an underwater wolf creature, which just says to me Angelina Jolie.
Exactly.
So she attacks. He goes to her cave to fight her. She seduces Beowulf. They do their thing, and then he kills her because Beowulf.
As any gentleman would.
Yeah, as any gentleman would. Well, okay, I think she tries to kill him, or no, I don't think she actually does die. I think she actually gets away.
Oh my gosh.
And then, many years later, the dragon comes, specifically for Beowulf, because the dragon is the product of their night together.
Are you serious?
Yes.
Okay.
The dragon is Beowulf's son.
Okay. That's...
And I was like, I was
guess
just like, there is no way that this is for real. There's no way that this is what actually happened in the poem.
I have been wrong all this time. Like,
yeah. And then at the end when he dies and Wiglaf is elevated to the successor, the final scene is Wiglaf seeing a vision of Beowulf's mother coming for him. Or no, of Grendel's mother.
okay.
So it's like it
I'm glad I haven't seen it because, as people who like know my opinions on Tolkien and stuff know I'm not a purist when it comes to Tolkien.
Yeah.
However, when it does come to ancient texts and old texts that are not read,
Yeah.
I do get defensive of it because I feel like that's probably the only exposure this person's going to get to it, and
Right.
it's wrong.
Yeah.
They're going to walk around with this idea in their head of what Beowulf is, which isn't right, and chances are we're going to forget this knowledge. This is a dead language. We're going to forget this, and then, the story that's going to survive is going to be some piece of crap Hollywood thing, that isn't even authentic.
Yeah. And that really is the unfortunate part, and I'm with you on that. I'm with you when it comes to adaptations. I'm generally quite forgiving if it diverts from the original text, particularly if the original text is something that is very popular.
Yeah.
But if it's something obscure, I sort of feel like if you're bringing it into a wider audience in a different medium, then it's incumbent upon you to really sort of explain this to them, or to be as authentic as you can.
And give an actual sample of what the original is like if you can't do that,
Yeah.
Like, I understand that Beowulf is like a kind of a... It's got like 3 climaxes, so you can't really just take that and slap it into a script.
Right.
But at the same time, you can try to do... I feel like the Two Towers did more justice to Beowulf than what you just described.
Yeah.
But,
yeah.
And a lot of Tolkien captures the same... you feel like it's the light of a flickering candle that's about to go out, but it's not out yet,
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
that part he does really well.
Yeah. What is that? Light of the King is saying, that's why we need more great writers and filmmakers like you and Josh.
Oh, that's sweet of you.
That's sweet. Well, I mean, Kelly is a great writer. I am an unequivocal hack. So.
No. I'm sorry, I call bullshit.
Okay. All right, fair enough.
So you're going to have to shut up or I'm going to start cursing on your show.
Great. This just went out live, I'm going to get a phone call from Chris. No, I'm not.
I apologize, Kelly, sir. I'm a corrupted youth.
That's okay. I'm a corrupting old man, so.
It's from all the doom and death and that we've been reading.
Yeah, there is a lot of doom, gloom, and death, because, Beowulf at the end of the day is not a very happy story.
No.
And that's like what sort of made me upset with the movie, was like, as unhappy as and dark as the poem is, the movie somehow made it darker and weirder and pretty much stupider.
Huh.
Yeah. Because it just felt utterly, hopeless by the end of the movie.
Yeah.
Because basically, like, what it implies in the last scene with Vigloff seeing Grendel's mother is that this is a cycle and it's starting all over again. Which is just stupid.
It is, and the thing that that the poem invokes and that Tolkien latched onto was the idea that there are these creatures left over from the old days, that the myths that you've heard of really were true at one point,
Right.
and that some of these animals or these monsters have survived, and Tolkien loves to kind of play with that, though his are usually a bit more benevolent, other than the Balrog, which you could argue the Balrog's just protecting his home, but
you could.
But there's this idea, of that there used to be, I think it's kind of a Dark Ages thing that before we were at this point where we could light our hall, there were these things, and there's also intense psychological parallels to be drawn between the Hall of Heorot and Grendel, you're in the well-lit, safe place. It's a big, beautiful structure. You're calm. You're secure in your mind, in your heart, in wherever you are in your life, and then out of the dark, out of nowhere, comes the Fenstalker, comes Grendel, and he breaks in and he sheds blood, and it's kind of a metaphor for you can be as content as you want. Something, life's going to throw you a curveball, and that's just the inevitable. It's not always a really negative curveball where 30 men are ripped to shreds and the walls are bathed in blood.
Yeah.
But, and I think that's one of the reasons that it has lasted so long is because in some level, everyone can relate to that poem. Even if it's just the sanctity of their mind being invaded by, the death of a loved one, natural disaster, they lose their job, whatever. Something to shake it up. And then you have to be Beowulf. You have to step up and go, okay, how am I going to deal with this? Yeah. And that's a very human struggle.
It is, and Light of the King brings up that point, which is he was victorious in most ways, and when he battles the dragon, he was near the end of his life, and that's very true, and I think like that's what makes Beowulf so appealing is that like he really is like I hate to say it, but he's a superhero. It's a superhero story.
Yeah, he has the strength of 30 men.
And I mean, like that's why these stories still have resonance today, because like it's this sort of mythical ideal of your potential. And so like that's the way I've always looked at superhero stories, is like they're like the story, they're kind of like the roadmap to greatness. Like people can try to emulate these great superheroes and become great themselves. And I mean, like, you see that with Superman. Maybe not so much with Batman, because he's kind of fueled by revenge.
Yeah.
But like Iron Man, who is not only battling enemies on the outside, but also his own inner demons.
Yeah.
Like, in the comics, he has like a big struggle with alcoholism, and has to defeat that. It's touched on a bit in Iron Man 2, but in a different sort of way. And Light of the King is now also saying, just like King David, who battles bears and lions. It's very true. And she had also made some parallels to between Beowulf and King David earlier, which I can totally see. And Jan is like, Josh is talking about Batman again.
Hey man,
I like my Batman. I just don't like Dark Knight Rises. Deal with it, Jan.
Dark Knight Rises is heavy. It's heavier than Beowulf.
Yeah, it's heavy, and it plays fast and loose with its own logic, which is what I had a real problem with. But I'm not going to get into another Dark Knight Rises rant.
So if you guys want, I have here one of my pieces of translation from early in the poem, and if you want, I could read like a paragraph and then read. We would always do kind of two translations. We would do what it literally says, and then a slightly more polished of what would make sense to us.
Okay. Yeah, I'd love to hear that. One quick thing before you start that. Light of the King is asking, how long did you spend on the actual translation?
A semester.
Okay.
So, the first semester was an introduction to the language and translating works other than Beowulf, which was where I did most of like the other poems, and also riddles. The Anglo-Saxons were very fond of riddles.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, most of their poems and songs were actually riddles. So, that's obviously where Tolkien was probably really exposed to a lot of these things. And then the next semester, yeah, we started Beowulf, which, to be fair, I could never, some of the words are familiar to me, but I could never sit and look at it and go, oh, this is that, and that, Part of that's because it is a dead language. Other part of it is because a year is not enough time to familiarize it. Especially now when you also, like an idiot like me, decided I'm also going to study Latin at the same time.
So basically your brain was exploding with dead languages.
Yeah! And Latin's so different. I mean, some of the rules are similar, but so I was memorizing twice as much, because both in Latin and to an extent in Old English, our language goes subject, object, verb. Mm-hmm. I ran to the store. Mm-hmm. In these languages, you can put any word anywhere you want in the sentence. The ending of the word will tell you what part of speech it plays, therefore where it goes in the sentence. So, any given word will have the direct object ending, the indirect object ending, the verb, Mm-hmm. So if you've studied a romantic language and like Spanish and you've learned to conjugate the verbs, imagine conjugating every single word in that sentence. So they call it declension. You decline the nouns. So that's just a lot to memorize.
Yeah.
For one language alone, much less two.
Yeah. You must have been an interesting person to talk to back then.
I was like brain dead all the time. I'm not gonna lie. Like for Latin, the only reason I could get my homework done was I would literally go into my professor's office and sit there with her and be like, how do I do this? Mm-hmm. Latin took me, it was a lot more difficult for me than Old English. And I think that, part of that's because it's like a math problem. Mm-hmm. And I don't know why. I think I took both classes at the same time because I am good at Spanish because I'm good with the oral stuff with hearing it. Stupidly thought, oh, it's a dead language. Like, I don't know, like, it's not spoken. It's not going to help you. So, yes, that was completely overly ambitious of me. I don't recommend it. They are both really cool languages to expose yourself to. Try not to do it at the same time because it'll take away from both of them.
Yeah, I would think so. So, yeah, if you want to read a little bit of your translation, maybe that's a good way for us to end the show.
It's part of the translation with parts circled by my professor going, this is the past participle, this is that. And I was always going, oh, yeah, you're right. How did I not notice that? All right. So this is line 785.
Okay.
Which is towards the beginning of the poem. Nolda erla hero, no cleo, which means the earls had no wish for shelter. A nicthina, or anything. Actually, that kind of sounds like anything. A nicthina. Thona quilcuman, the murderous visitor, which would be Grendel. Mm-hmm. Quinkne forletan, living alive to let go. So they had no intention of letting the murderous visitor, who is still living alive, because I guess if you're just living, you're not living alive. They had no intention of letting him go. Ne his livdagas, not in his life days. Livdagas. See, that's a kenning that I love. His life days.
Yeah.
His livdagas. The old enigium, or any day, or any men, nita telta, to consider. So, the shielder of the earls had no wish for anything to let go alive the murderous visitor, nor his life days of any of his people beneficial. Okay, so that's the polished translation of that sentence, which is still your mind is twisting trying to.
Yeah, it is kind of yeah.
You know, like in modern English, we would say the leader knew that Grendel was still alive and did not want to give away any of his men's life days.
Mm-hmm.
You know, basically he didn't want to risk his men's lives.
Right.
And it's such a different way of communicating that same concept, but that's what I love. I love feeling my brain do flip-flops and try to figure it out.
Yeah, that's how it was when I was studying Japanese.
Oh, I'll bet.
Because their sentence structure is also completely different from ours, and so, like, your brain, like, really has to do, like, all these weird loop-de-loops and flips just to sort of get the same idea across.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And it's neat to see the different ways of thinking about the world around you.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. So
that's a sentence.
That's a sentence. All right.
So you can see how it's and that's like without all my notes, like I was identifying, okay, this word is a that, you know how words have genders in a lot of language, feminine, masculine. Then there's also neuter in these old languages. So you'd have to, it's a neuter singulative, a genitive plural, accusative singular, you know.
That is a lot of words.
It was torture. So that part I don't miss, but what like I said, like I love the feel of the words, the feel of the language, and you know, and I think Tolkien had obviously a mind keen on language and inventing language and relishing in language, and you know, you're saying how it reminds you of Elvish, and that was his playground.
Yeah.
He invented his own language.
Yeah.
But obviously some of the words just ensnared his imagination just on their own merit as well.
Yeah.
So you guys all just got to expose yourselves through reading Beowulf to, you know, the same story. And what's cool is, you know, since this is Tolkien's translation, it is how he viewed the words and viewed the story that gave birth eventually to Middle-earth.
Yeah. And Lay of the King is just saying one more thing. One of my favorite lines is 1510, the Raven Black announced with merry heart the heaven's gladness.
Yeah.
That's a good one.
Yeah. And there's a lot of beautiful things like that. Like I was just glancing through my notes and I saw like the wolf and the raven were considered negative animals because they would literally see them on the edge of the battlefield, and if you were a warrior you would see them and you would know they're waiting for you to die so they could eat you.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
And so that just puts a whole different spin on two animals that I think are gorgeous and beautiful and I just love, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So it's just it's a fascinating culture.
Yeah. Yeah. So well, I think we're just gonna bring this one to a close now. This was a lot of fun, very insightful.
I'm glad we finally got to do
Yeah,
that.
finally.
I apologize for all the scheduling conflicts.
Well, you know, you had your crazy convention tours.
I know, it's nuts.
Yeah, but now you can finally relax, and
Yes.
we can talk Beowulf finally.
Yes.
And we have, and I know Light of the King has read it. I know there are a few other people in the chat who have read it. Anybody who hasn't read it, I hope that this conversation has intrigued you enough to want to pick it up. I do think that this is an important story that should be read, like, as a poem and not seen as a movie.
Yes.
So Light of the King is also saying, I want to go back to the British Museum and see the Sutton Hoo exhibit. I am fascinated by ship burials.
Yeah.
I need to go there at some point.
Yeah, and you know, I'm not trying to disparage Tolkien at all, but there are other translations too. I know the Seamus Heaney one's really popular. I read another one. For the life of me, I can't remember the name of the translator, but you know, Tolkien's goal was to make it very accessible. But other people who have translated it have tried to keep the poem and the mysticism and the metaphor of the language intact in their translation. Mm-hmm. And personally, I prefer that just because it gets my imagination going a lot more.
Well, now I'm curious to read some of those other translations.
I'll get you the name of the one that I read the most, because there's one I've read 2 or 3 times.
Okay.
But, yeah.
All right, cool. So I want to thank everybody who was participating in the chat today. There were a lot of you here today.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Thank you all for coming. Yeah, we got a lot of folks in the chat. But Light of the King, thank you for all your wonderful questions.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you
I don't
to
think-
all the new people who came because there was somebody from Happy Hobbit here. Otherwise, you wouldn't care. But
You should care.
yes,
Reading
yes.
is important.
Reading is quite important, yes. And hopefully those of you who are here for the first time will come back more often. We might do another episode next week. We may not. It all depends on who I can get as a guest, because we've had a few too many episodes of just me by myself, and that makes for very awkward pauses.
I would do the same if I had my own show and I was just like sitting there talking. If I didn't
Yeah.
have my sister to play off of, I would like have a puppet or something terrifying.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, like, so we've had a couple episodes of it just being me, so I need to get some more guests in here to play off of each other.
Can you have people Skype in like I did? Like,
Oh yeah, yeah. I try to get people to Skype in. I had Kirsten Skype in one time. Green Dragon.
she knows Old English as well.
Yeah, she did. She did, and we talked to Beowulf a little bit. We were that was an episode on Shakespeare that we were doing.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, because she used to be in the Royal Shakespeare Company, so you don't get much more authoritative than that.
Exactly.
So yes, to everybody who came in late, didn't get to see the whole thing, I'll be putting the full archive of this up on YouTube probably in a couple hours or so, and so you'll be able to watch it again at your leisure. And as I said at the beginning of the show, our book of the month for August is All Creatures, Great and Small by James Herriot, which I highly recommend. It was a book that I found quite surprisingly good, considering that it's basically a book about a veterinarian in the countryside, but utterly fascinating.
It's also a British TV show.
Yeah, it was it was based on this book.
Oh, okay.
So yeah. So I'll post on Facebook and on Twitter going forward this week as to whether or not we'll have an episode next week. Kelly, thank you so much for coming on and talking Beowulf with us.
Thank you for having me.
It was my pleasure having you on, and hopefully we'll have you on another time
That'd be
talking
awesome.
about other stuff.
Yeah.
So thank you all to everybody. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, The One Ring. Thank you, Universe, for creating the planets and all of this.
Thank you, Dirt, for my lunch.
Thank you, Coffee, for keeping me awake. And so I will maybe see you all next week, if not 2 weeks from now, and never stop reading.
Good advice.